So media leads into faith, and you'll understand what I mean by this when we kind of walk through the conversation of faith. Some statistics really scare me. One quote I heard says that half of all worshipers say that they're not growing in their faith. Like half. Meaning, if I could quickly poll you right now, and half of you watching in whatever room you're in right now are not growing in your faith, like all stop. Like everything we're doing has to change. Pascal once said the greatest enemy of the spiritual life was inattention and complacency. So here's an easy question. Are you actively pursuing your faith? The answer is yes, or the answer is no. There is no kind of middle ground there. Are you actively pursuing your faith? Well, let's put it into an up and down. How much time this week did you spend watching television, playing video games, you name it? How much time this week did you spend doing anything spiritual? And statistic after statistic say that it's actually way more the television, the movies, and anything else. I think it was George Barna who once said we spend it was like 7 times more watching TV in 1 week than we do doing anything spiritual. A spiritual discipline, also called a spiritual practice, is just a good habit. And these habits allow us to kind of remain open to God and develop ourselves spiritually. I like to call it training. I coached rep baseball a couple years ago, and I would train my players, and we could train them in how to play the game better. And it's the same with faith. It's not just we become a Christian and we're done. There's this ongoing change that we have to do. Now, I will say one quick quote here, and it's kind of an alliteration, but ritual without relationship is ridiculous. I forget where I heard that, but I kind of agree. First, we meet Jesus, then we do these things. So if you're wondering where to start, on YouTube, you can find my top 10 books on spiritual disciplines, and there's a lot of these things. They're just daily things we can do. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go through a bunch of them really quickly. The goal is not to go through all of, like, the first one is prayer and meditation. The goal is to kind of talk about it quickly and give you some thoughts on it, and then you can kind of work on these things later. But prayer and meditation, are you only praying when you're in need or when you want something? That's not a prayer life. That's making God like a dispensary where you pull a lever and he gives you what you want. John Piper once said, one of the great uses of Twitter and Facebook will be to prove at the last day that prayerlessness was not from a lack of time. Students, one of the great uses of Twitter and Snapchat, or Twitter and TikTok, or whatever else you want to put in there. So really simply, how do you make this practical? We must take what we learn and implement it into our lives. So how do you do this? Some people read their Bibles and pray. Some write journals and pray. Other people, I don't think many people kind of clasp their fingers and kneel at the edge of their bed like a Precious Moments figurine in the 1980s, but you still see things like that. Some people go to prayer groups at their church. And I would just say this, if your prayer life is passionate and vibrant, keep going. If it's not, change. With everything I say today, if you need change, don't keep doing the same thing over and over expecting a different result. We call that insanity. Do something different. I'm at one talk and someone says, what do you want me to do different? And I'm like, I don't know. Why don't you do a prayer walk? And the person actually said, you want me to walk around my neighborhood yelling at my neighbors? Why would you think that? No, just walk around your community praying for the people in your houses or other people. Like the idea that you're yelling at houses, I don't understand. Study is just, this idea of how, like, we become a Christian, like, how do you then read your Bible? Now, statistics really scare me here. One statistic, and the stat is over 80% of Christians have never read the Bible cover to cover. Many of us start Matthew, Mark, Luke, and we kind of stop, or we begin at Genesis, Exodus, and we kind of get bogged down in Leviticus. And I understand that there are some tough, books, and they're hard to read, but if we're going to claim that the Bible is it, we should actually know what it is. Wayne Cordero wrote in his book, The Divine Mentor, the best interpretation of the Bible is the Bible itself. Not another book, not a denomination's teaching. Always correct everything you read back to the actions and the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Go all the way back to him and always correct back to the source. The fence idea, if you don't know this, is if you build a fence and you cut, like the second kind of piece of wood you cut will be a little bit off. But if you use that as your next piece of thing to cut and the next one is a bit off, soon the fence will start getting higher and higher. It's the idea of using kind of the wrong source. And for us as Christians, always kind of use the source, as the Bible and our faith. Now, Soren Kierkegaard once said, we pretend to be unable to understand the Bible because we know the minute we understand, we are obliged to obey. I think we know what we should and shouldn't do, but I think sometimes we just don't do it. So, how do you read the Bible? In the last few years, I've been using an app called Read Scripture. It's done by the Bible Project, and I can't say how much I love this. This is this like cartoon art. But before I read like the book of Jeremiah or whatever else, there's a video, mostly between I think 8 and 11 minutes, and they'll actually talk about the overarching narrative of that book. Then you read the book, and it gives you like I use the app on my iPad or iPhone. It gives you the 2 or 3 chapters of the day, and it's always a song or a proverb. But it makes so much more sense when someone's giving this overarching idea. Now, there's other apps. Most of us know one called YouVersion. I used one a few years ago, a lot called Glow, and I think as you get older, an application commentary is really helpful. Now, I read both digitally and physically. What I mean by that is I love using technology for the best it can give me. So like the Read Scripture app, I take those videos and it tells me what I'm going to read next. But when I read, I actually usually flip over to a physical Bible. I like it better because I can underline, I can take notes, and I just love that idea of a physical book. I do use an application commentary digitally. On the left here is kind of the scripture. On the right is the application commentary, meaning if I'm reading whatever, Matthew 3, it will say, here's like the original context of Matthew 3, meaning in the time it was written, what is the politics of the day? What was happening in the church of the day? I read the Bible through the lens of I'm a 49-year-old Caucasian male in Toronto, right? We need to read the Bible through the Middle Eastern lens often, and just ways we don't do it. But then it goes through how we can connect it with today. So you take your 5 minutes reading a chapter, and there might be half an hour explanation here. So how do you do this? And again, make a plan, and not like every January you make a plan, like find a way to get habitual about this. I've been really big on habits in the last few years, reading books on habits. So what is it that you could do that you could start reading the Bible? I do a thing these days is before I check my email, because I work from home, I have to do my Bible reading. It's become part of my routine. If you say, I'll do it after I check my email, and then work, and then something else happens. I like the idea of being molded, meaning the idea of reading scriptures that I'm being changed by it. And it's about time. It does take your time. Here we have fasting. Now, fasting is interesting because fasting doesn't just have to mean fasting from food. I believe you can fast from technology. It's about giving up something for something bigger than you. A friend of mine fasted from golf the other year. He said he was golfing too much and he felt like it was taking away from things, so he gave up golf for a season to concentrate on his family and his faith. It says in Isaiah 58, this is the kind of fasting I'm after, to break the chains of injustice, to get rid of exploitation in the workplace, free the oppressed, cancel debts. What I'm interested in seeing you do is sharing your food with the hungry, inviting the homeless and poor into your homes, putting clothes on the shivering, ill-clad, and being available to your own families. That's a lot in that. And I'm always, I don't know what the term would be, fascinated, humbled. I'm at a public school a few years ago. I think I'm speaking on mental health. And I said, it was a Friday, and I said to the guy something about, well, I guess we can't set up in the caf because it's lunch. And he said, oh no, we're fasting, it's Friday. Pardon? And he said, well, it's not, it's not like you're Christian fasting. He said, our school has decided every Friday, the kids set this up. So they said poutine and a pop or whatever for lunch was $5. And so he says every Friday, every kid gives in $5. There's 1,000 students. And he said literally every kid gives in $5. That's $5,000. And every Friday they build a well. I honestly, it's one of those moments I got a little teary and I'm like, I don't see that in the church. I don't see that in my Christian schools. I don't see that in my Catholic schools. I'm at a public school, people who mostly don't know Jesus. And here they are actually giving every week. And they do all these things, like they actually, it's the best student of the week. He or her gets to choose where the well is built, and they actually then follow it all week on like social media and stuff as the well is built. You get my point here with all these things. Each of these we need to look at. The books that you can find later will give you better ways to do this. Talk about best practices with each other. Sabbath, have one, says a hypocrite who had a breakdown due to stress 8 years ago. Do you know how many Sabbaths I had in probably the 10 years before my breakdown? I'd say none. I would go to church. I would work in the afternoon. I never had a day of what I would call faith, family, and friends. I do now. Now, I'm also someone who works often on Sundays. I speak maybe a morning or an evening. I'm often away. And those of us whose Sunday is a work day have to take the Sabbath on another day, meaning it's really hard, but sometimes it's a Monday Every Sunday I go through my week and I'll be like, okay, Thursday's my Sabbath this week. And I got to find a way to do faith, family, and friends on the day when most people are working. Now, I also do a weird thing. Every Sunday night, my phone dings and says, when is your Sabbath? And a minute later, it says, when is your Saturday? Because it's not just I work 6 days a week and I have like a Sabbath. I need a day to go shopping and do the things I need to do around the house. At an event in Ottawa many years ago, Ken says it's better to enter into work from a place of rest rather than to stop work in desperate need of rest. Wayne Mueller says we stop because it's time to stop. I really, really like that. At a Catalyst conference a long time ago, back in 2014, they say busyness isn't ultimately about our schedule. Our pace of life is more about our theology than our watches. Our relationship with God should and will affect every part of our life, including what we do with our time. Now, to be honest, this one is my worst spiritual discipline, being quiet and being alone. Be still and know that I am God. I struggle with anxiety. I think I have a bit of OCD and other things in my life. I once heard a quote that says, we seem to distract ourselves by engaging in ceaseless, never-ending activity and amusement. When was the last time you were just quiet? Even pausing for a second or two in this talk is uncomfortable for us as people because we're not used to being quiet. It says in Isaiah, and your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. It says in 1 Kings 19 that God didn't come in the fire and in the earthquake or the wind, and it's a wind that shatters rocks, by the way, but that God comes in my favorite translation, God comes in the sheer silence. And most of us have never been quiet for 5 minutes by choice in the last 5 years. Wherever you're at in the next few days, take a few minutes to just be, right? No phone, watch, television, friends, just be. Go for a walk away from people. Just go sit on a chair and just be. Every one of us needs to have a place where we can just be. Stephen Neal once said, modern man is a little afraid of being alone and of being still. Because we are afraid to know ourselves, we find difficulty in knowing one another. Because we do not know how to withdraw into ourselves, we find it hard to fully go into other people. John Wesley once wrote, and my silence speaketh unto thee, old language, but I really, really like it. So how do you live out solitude and silence? And again, I would say each of you has to figure this out. The students, the parents, the leaders, we need to figure out how to do this. Where I live near Lake Ontario, so I just find there's something about nature for me for solitude and silence. And so I'm often walking by the water, and for me, that's it. Two, I would say one thing I've done a lot is that I drive to and from speaking events, and my new rule is I drive one of the directions with no noise. Now, if it's a 10-minute drive to a local church, a 40-minute drive, it gets a bit harder. When it's a 5-hour drive somewhere, but I do it, and it's hard. Like it's 5 hours of talk radio, sports radio, music, and then maybe I'm coming home and just being quiet. For me, it's just become something that I've learned to it's almost like something I need to learn to do better. And exercise and walking has become one of those things. Now, this isn't prayer. It could be. Sometimes we put prayer and solitude and silence together, but sometimes it's listening. It's just being quiet. Now, one of the ones we don't like to talk about is money, simple and sacrificial living. The little thing says worshiping created things and not the creator himself. You ever watch one of the shows, there's Property Brothers and many others where they, rebuild houses? I always love when they're like, you deserve granite countertops. And I'm always like, no, you don't. Why do you deserve a granite countertop? What is the statistic? 3.5 billion people live on $3 a day? And we believe we need granite countertops. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying it's an interesting way we view the world because you could have been born in extreme poverty. I'm at an event a few years ago, and there's a guy at the front, and he talks about being born. I forget where it was, but he was born basically into a refugee camp, and he struggled most of his life, and then he was brought to North America. I think it was Compassion or World Vision, but one of the story he talked about was just that it could have been you. It could have been me. You didn't choose to be born wherever you are, and most of us watching this live in a place of wealth and freedom and peace. I heard another speaker once who talked about being sold into the sex slave trade as a young kid. And he was released by, I think the group was called International Justice Mission. And at the conference, he again said to the group of students, my life could have been yours. You didn't choose your life. And he said, I didn't choose mine. What do you do with that? It says in Matthew, where and I'll put money is where your heart will be also. In Matthew, the place where your money is the place you will most want to be and end up being. There used to be a website called the globalrichlist.com, and in it, they actually talk about how if your family makes $50,000 a year, you're the richest 0.62% of every human being in the world. Tim Keller in Counterfeit Gods says, your money flows most effortlessly towards your heart's greatest love. So what's your heart's greatest love? We talked earlier about what you do with your time. How about your money? Where did you put your money? And students, you're some of the most well-off generation ever. I mean, when you can spend $200 on a t-shirt and, lots of money on Air Jordans or whatever other shoes you want to buy. I'm not saying everyone, but I'm saying for vast numbers of us. If you added up all the money you spent on entertainment and food and everything like that and clothes and put how much you gave to the church or organizations or other things, most of us will find we know where it is. There's a quote, I don't know who says this, but it says, you cry over spilled champagne. Your complaints are not over the lack of necessities, but the abundance of benefits. You bellyache over the frills, not the basics, over benefits, not essentials. The source of your problem is your blessing. It's one of those quotes you got to think on. There's a shift in direction from the Old Testament to the New Testament about from how much we give to why we give, what's in your heart. One of my pastors at my church, Dave Adams, once said, everything changes when you stop being a taxpayer and start being an investor into the kingdom of God. You see why each of these are big conversations? There's entire books written on each of them. Service to others. I love traveling through the school systems and the churches and seeing the ways that people are getting involved with things. Food banks and soup kitchens and all these other things. Gary, I always say it wrong, Haugen was the founder of International Justice Mission. He says the greatest enemy in our struggle to stop oppressing and injustice is always the insidious etiquette of silence. I would say don't be silent. Students, I love what your generation, you stand up for justice. You stand up for fresh water. And don't ever tell me I'm only in grade 6, I'm only in grade 10. I heard of a girl in grade 6 once who raised $250,000 to build wells in other countries around the world. Grade 6. I heard of it was a 9 or a 10 girl who in her small town where she lived, she mobilized for a food bank. And she said, my mom in our green caravan would go around to the schools and the mayors and all these other, the mayor's building, whatever, all these other places collecting food for the food bank. And she was in high school. Don't ever sell yourself short. Sometimes I think there's amazing ideas coming from you as a generation of students. Now, evangelism, and D.T. Niles once said, evangelism is just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. Now, there's been a shift. It used to be believing and then belonging. When I grew up in my church, if you believed in God, we would then baptize you, and then you then belong. We'd shake your hand, and you belong to our club. These days, it's the opposite. People want to belong, and then maybe they'll believe. Some of you watching tonight are out at youth group or whatever other reason you're watching this, and you're just still questioning Christianity, and you're debating things and want to know more about Jesus, and I think it's great. But it's only after you might belong that you might believe. Now, evangelism, the statistics scare me. Some church growth experts I read in an article says that 85% of churches in North America, 85, are declining in size. And of the 15% that are growing, only 1% are growing because of new conversions. Meaning 14% are growing because other churches are dying. If your church grows by 10 people because 5 churches closed locally, I know you grew, but it's not someone who didn't know Jesus from that house over there, and by our relationship with them or a program we did, they suddenly came into church and now are part of your family. It's because that church closed. And as a side note, you got to find a church that works for you. I get people might move churches, but we do need to find a way to reach the communities around us. I've known Eric for many years. As I travel on the speaking circuit, I see him a lot. He's one of those guys who paints. He also speaks more and more, but he paints while musicians sing. And this picture is called The Real Sea, and he says it's based after Isaiah 57:20. But if you look closely at it, it's actually not waves, it's people. And he says it's our responsibility as the lighthouse. It's our responsibility to find them. I did my master's degree at Wheaton Grad School in Chicago, and it was a master's degree in leadership and evangelism. I took it for leadership, fell in love with evangelism. One day I'm in my class with my professor and someone asked the question, Dean, which evangelism strategies work? To which he said, I don't know. Got to be honest, I love honesty. And then he said a line which has rocked my world for years since. He says, I think we've inoculated an entire generation against Christ. And then he left, and then we had break, and no one moved. And to be honest, we were kind of chatting, and the question was, well, what strategies do work? And we all kind of said, we don't know. And the one that we all agreed on was Alpha. When we have baptism Sunday at my church, almost everyone who gets baptized, it's like blah, 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 like their testimony, Alpha, and then they get dunked, and the next person, blah, 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 Alpha, dunked. And I hope one day when I'm able to have more time and I'm off the road as much to be able to work with Alpha. But here's the reality. If people are meeting Jesus in your church, great. If they're not, everything's got to change. I get we're doing, there's Sunday mornings and it might be for Christians and we're doing musical worship and we're doing teaching and we're doing all of these things. But if somehow people aren't meeting Jesus in our churches, we have to add to that. And it might mean a paradigm shift. I don't know, but somehow we have to go to them and somehow we have to meet the people who don't know Jesus. Now, I would also say this, if you're a student watching, Alpha, there's an Alpha for adults, but there is a Teen Alpha as well. And I would encourage you, if you're watching this alone, just search Teen Alpha. You'll find it online, but it's a wonderful thing to go through with your youth group as well. Submission, this is an easy one. It's God, you. It is so easy to say. It is so hard to live out. Now, musical worship is an interesting one. And I say musical worship because the truth is it is musical worship. Worship is bigger than just music. And the truth is, musical worship is not like we always see at concerts. It's not laser lights and smoke and, everyone there. Often it is people, and I love this picture here because this is what I often see. This is what I often see. We look bored out of our minds. We're singing some of the most incredible lyrics and our hands are in our pockets and we're bored looking up at the sky. So here's what I would say with worship. Don't worship the worship. Don't forget the reasons we worship God and the debates on how we worship God. It's time we stop getting caught up on and hung up on the different ways of outward expressions of musical worship and realize that worship is every aspect of everything you do on every given day of your life. It is how you are sexually, it's how you are ethically, it's what you do with your time, your money, your resources, your energy, how you date, what you listen to. It's all of that is worship. And I'm concerned sometimes that we don't realize that worship is everything. But during musical worship, what does it mean when we are saying to God something and not believing it? I was at a conference a number of years ago and the band, the song, I can't remember if it was the band Starfield, because I know they've stopped touring, or if it was just the song was being sung. And it's this, O great and mighty one, with one desire we come, that you would reign in us. We're offering up our lives a living sacrifice, that you would reign in us. And I'm like, are you? Did you really come to youth group tonight or come to a conference or for whatever reason as you're singing this song, did you come for one reason that God would rule and reign in your life? Because if you didn't, what are we singing to God? Other songs talk about all that I am and we barely give anything. A.W. Tozer once said, Christians don't tell lies, they just go to church and sing them. Have you ever read a quote? I call these stop quotes, meaning when I'm reading them, it's like, I think I'm done. I read this, and now this goes through my mind. Every church service, every place I'm at a camp, every conference when I'm singing and there's musical worship, I'm like, am I believing what I'm saying? It says in Isaiah 29:13, these people come near to me with their mouth and they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. I think it matters. This is easy. This is not. It's easy to raise your hands in worship. It's so hard to say, God, I give you everything in my life. And I just think we need to think through the constructs of worship, think through what we're singing. What I often say to people is this, stop singing. Just stop singing. And what I mean by this is I want you to read the lyrics. I want you to read through them, and if you believe them, then I want you to catch up and sing them, pray them, whatever else. Whether you stand, you sit, you kneel, whether you're whatever. But just know what you're singing, and if you believe it, then sing it. But don't just sing something because it's on the screen. Community, we call this fellowship. It's a very old school word, but stop serving Christ in permanent isolation. There's two groups in the world that show incredible loneliness. Mine, and students, yours. Used to be just mine. Men 40s, 50s, and 60s were this lonely, they always said men on average have 1.1 friends, which is weird. It's like this part of a friend. What it means is that some men have 2 friends and some men have no friends sometimes. It's just statistics. But over the last number of years, it's been growing more and more that you as a student are now in this incredibly lonely place, which is interesting because you're the most connected generation ever, but you're the most disconnected generation ever. So how can you create good community in your school, in your church, small group, whatever it might be? Communion, take it. Some of these just are really easy. Take it. I'm at a church once, and I was telling a story. I was out once at a restaurant. It was just like a burger place, and we're talking about communion, and I told the story to these guys. I was at a church once, and I'm talking about communion, and a guy came up to me, because my church does 2 types of communion, regular past communion, and we call it come forward communion, where you come forward and someone has like the elements and you take the bread or the cracker and the juice from the front. And the guy said to me afterwards, "I can't believe you said something so unbiblical." And I'm like, "Which part?" I say a lot in my talks. And he said, "Oh, the communion thing." And I said, "What do you think is unbiblical about coming to the front?" And he says, "Well, he literally said, when Jesus passed the wafers and the grape juice." And I paused waiting for a smile. And I said, "That's not in the Bible, right?" Like, communion was a meal. Like, it was actually a meal, which is actually what I miss most from my Baptist roots, is like potluck Wednesdays, where you have community together. But I'm at this restaurant, I'm telling these 3 or 4 youth pastors about it, and this guy says, I hear that a lot, and he says, "Well, let's do communion now." And I remember kind of saying, like, "What?" And so we used my bun, I don't know, it was my bun, and someone else's Coke Zero, and it was the most moving communion I've ever had in my life. There's 5 guys at a restaurant. Communion, take it. And the last one here, and this isn't the last, there are many others, but the last one here is teaching. And I just say, get some. And now we could say, is preaching good teaching? Is teaching, I think teaching preaches and preaching teaches. There's a whole conversation there. But I just say, I think one of the harder jobs is a Sunday morning preaching pastor who gets up, and in the audience, depending on your church, might be someone from grades 7 and 8, all the way through to people who are 95 years of age. And in that moment, you have 7 different learning styles. Many churches have many different languages. You have people from all over the world, different cultures and traditions. And in that, you have people who've known Jesus for 1 week, 5 weeks, 10 years, 50 years. People who've been backslidden, fallen away, are not following Jesus for the same amounts of times. And in 30 minutes or less, because everyone's going to leave after that, you have to do everything, and you have to be biblical but funny and give leadership, and it just isn't possible. And there are some days that my pastor starts to preach, and I listen, and I've been in church a long time, and sometimes I'm like, this is really good, but it might not be for me. And that's okay. And I pray for the people in the audience that, that this might be something that's life-changing for them. I actually usually, in my app, I use an app called Evernote. I have a prayer, my friends who don't know Jesus, and I pray for them, and I read my Bible. And that day in church, I might not have got teaching, but I had some musical worship, and I had community, quote unquote, fellowship, and I had other things, but I might need to get teaching somewhere else. And the truth is today, and if I had my phone with me, I'd hold it up. On your phone, you have every church in the world. Students, you can listen to, if you're only learning as a student or as an adult, just like on a, whether it's youth group on Friday night or on a Sunday morning, if you're only learning then, it's like exercise. If you exercise 1 day a week, you're really not going to get gains. You can be learning all the time. Find podcasts from great people and add that into your, your own church conversation. And then whether you're taking a bus to school or, whatever it is, put on a podcast and listen to it. Your earbuds are in anyways. Just switch what you're listening to. We go back to your worldview shapes your values and your values shape your actions. And I say this is Josh. I think it's Josh. I read the book that I thought this was in, and I was wrong recently. So I'm still going to say it's Josh, but I might be wrong. And Dallas says, from the contents of our heart, we see our world and interpret reality. It's from his book, Revolution of Character. Your worldview matters. Daily spiritual disciplines and practices matter. Which of these can you get better at? Which of these can you incorporate into your life? Because you do need to improve in the ones that you're not doing well at. This is just kind of part of our faith journey. And this is the conversation today on faith.